Not too horrible, Shilian said. So did he? I know this question is more personal in nature and it's not easy to answer, which was why I didn't ask in the general communication array. It's necessary for the mission, and the information will never be divulged. You've misunderstood, Your Highness, Ling Wen replied. It's not that this question isn't easy to answer, but it's that old Pei really has had too many intimate female friends. Your question is so sudden, I don't know which one you're referring to at the moment. Shilian almost slipped in his step. All right. Then among General Pei's female friends, is there one who is possessive, extremely jealous, and has some form of disability? Now that you've mentioned it, I do recall someone, Ling Wen replied. Shilian sent 2 more veils flying, causing another round of applause, and he spun around, cupping his hands at the audience in thanks. Tell me, Ling Wen began. Before Old Pei ascended, he was a general. He became involved with the female general of an enemy state on the battlefield, someone extremely beautiful and fierce in character. Her name was Shonji. Okay, Shonji, Julian acknowledged. Ling Wen continued. General Pei is someone who... When he sees a beautiful woman, he'll have to go and entangle himself even if there's a blade to his throat. This woman led an army and crossed swords with him, and she was defeated. Shonji became a prisoner of war and was taken to the enemy camp. While the guards weren't paying attention, she was planning to end her life on the spot, but she did not succeed. A general cut her verdant sword in half with one swing of his blade and saved her. And this dashing General Pei of the enemy state was the General Ming Guang who later ascended. As for this General Pei, 1, he was always someone who cherished beauties, and 2, the result of the war was already determined. So even if the fighting dragged on, the situation was already impossible to flip, and so Shonji was released. However, with all this frequent contact back and forth, it was easy to imagine what would come of it. Just then, one of the brides caught Shilian's leg and dug her fingers in, almost sinking her claws into his flesh. He wanted to kick out at first, but realized at this angle he could only kick her face. Well, you can't hit a lady's face, Shilian thought, so he changed his position and kicked her shoulder instead, while sending another veil flying. Sounds like a beautiful tale. It was a beautiful tale at first, Ling Wen said, but what killed it was that Shonji was adamant about being General Pei's lover for the rest of his life. Shilian ran a couple of steps and leapt, scaling up the roof, then looked down at the 5 or 6 brides who continued to close in on him down below. He wiped away his sweat. There isn't anything wrong for a woman to want to be the only lover in a lifetime. There isn't, Ling Wen said. But when two countries clash, the battlefield is heartless. Those 2 had originally agreed, willingly, that it was going to be a short-lived affair, and that today would exist but not tomorrow, and to speak only of romance and not of war. But with someone like Old Pei, I'll be honest, it's already pretty good if he doesn't cheat on you. However, Shonji was a dignified lady general and intense in temperament. If it was something she wanted, she'd clutch on firmly without ever letting go. Hold on, Shilian interrupted. Tell me first, is Shonji disabled? And how so? It's her... Ling Wen's voice abruptly came to a stop. For goodness sake, every time when he got to the most important part, the bit of spiritual power he'd borrowed would run out. It seemed next time he'd have to get straight to the point right from the start. In between flying and jumping, Shilian rapidly reorganized his thoughts. If the bandaged boy wasn't the ghost groom, and this group of villagers had also confirmed that the ghost groom wasn't among them, then the only place left to hide was among the 17 brides. When Shilian had snuck into the fold, the ghost groom couldn't immediately tell that the numbers were wrong. On the flip side, when the ghost groom mixed in with the bride, Shilian also couldn't tell there was an extra corpse at a single glance. Now that he thought about it closely, after the silk band Roya had injured the ghost groom, he only saw a ball of black mist stealing for the forest, but he couldn't say for sure that the ball of black mist contained a person. What probably actually happened was that when he rushed out of the temple to give chase, the ghost groom remained in the temple full of black mist, brushing past him and returning to the back of the hall, hiding itself like a leaf among the trees and mixing in with the corpse of the brides. Then, the ghost groom wasn't a groom, but a bride, a woman dressed in a wedding dress. Since it was a woman, many things could now be explained. For example, why there was no temple of Mingguang on or around Mount Yuzhen. It wasn't that the locals didn't want to build the temples. It was because they couldn't. Xiao Ying had said, I heard that every time the construction of a temple of Mingguang was in works, there would always be a fire for some reason halfway through. This didn't sound like a coincidence at all, and could be nothing but arson. Why set fires to burn temples? Under normal circumstances, it would be because of hatred. So, then why would there be a temple of Mingguang on Mount Yujin that was locked within an enchantment to keep out visitors? Yet the maintenance and the craftwork of the divine statue within the temple were so exquisite. Why was the ghost bride all decked out in a wedding dress herself, but couldn't bear to see other brides in wedding dresses smile when passing through Mount Yujin? Why, when every dot was connected, Shilian couldn't think of any other answer besides jealousy and possessiveness. And at that odd sound, like cloth-covered rods dragging something heavy, if it was truly the sound of footsteps, then Shilian could only think of one possibility. Every bride that was chasing him had been veiled. Shilian finally landed on the back on the ground, let out a light sigh, steadied himself, and straightened up to count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 10. 7 brides had hopped into the forest, and Nun Feng had gone to chase them. He veiled 10 brides, and they were all here. That meant there was one more who hadn't shown her face. Thump, thump. Thump, thump. Coming from behind him. Shilian slowly turned around. An exceedingly short, small form entered his field of vision. He drew in a small breath and thought, I knew it. The short, small woman before his eyes was dressed in red wedding robes, but there was no air of joy, only sorrow. The reason she was short wasn't because that was her natural stature, but because she was kneeling on the ground. The bones of both her legs were broken, but the legs remained, and she had been using her knees to walk all this time. The odd thump-thump sound he heard was the sound of her dragging her 2 broken legs to hop across the ground. That female ghost bore a handsome, oval face, her brows high and arching. She was truly exceedingly beautiful. No wonder the men had spoken of her so much before. While her beauty was initially laced with 3 parts heroism, it was now stormy with resentment, as if she had been trapped in a small, confined space for years, barred from the light of the sun. She was kneeling on the ground, and the bridal robe was tattered and frayed below the knees. Shilian and the ghost stared at each other unyieldingly for a while, before he spoke up. Shonji. It seemed it had been many years since anyone called her by that name. It was a long time before the resentment on her face quietly faded some, and a flash of light shone in her eyes. Was it he who sent you to find me? She asked. Shilian supposed that this he naturally referred to General Pei. Shonji then pressed on. What about the man himself? Why won't he come see me? That passionate expression and hopeful tone while she spoke made Shilian feel like he'd best not say he didn't. Seeing that he hesitated to respond, Shonji slumped onto the ground. Her back leaned against that handsome, tall, martial god statue. Her bright red bridal robe spread about her on the ground like a giant flower of blood. Her hair was disheveled and her face filled with agonizing torment, as if she was suffering from extreme misery. Why won't he come see me? Shilian couldn't answer this question either, so he could only remain silent. Shonji raised her head to gaze upon the divine statue and moaned sorrowfully. Pei, dear! Oh, Pei, dear, I've betrayed my kingdom for you, abandoned everything and become like this. Why won't you come see me any more? She pulled at her own hair, demanding, Could your heart be made of iron? Shilian didn't react to any of this, but when he heard her, he silently pondered. Shonji said she betrayed her kingdom for General Pei. Could that mean that this General Pei she spoke of cooled her into divulging enemy secrets while the two were in the heat of their passion, causing Shonji's kingdom to fall into a disadvantage on the battlefield? She also said that it was because of General Pei that she'd become like this, and by this, she naturally meant this tragic broken-legged form. Shonji was a female general. Upon the battlefield, there was no way she would be disabled, so those legs of hers could have only been broken later. Could that have something to do with General Pei, too? Was it General Pei deserting what he started that led to such deep and severe resentment? Shilian felt everything he thought of was rather vulgar. However, with Zhongji having such profound resentment to the point where she was harming innocent lives, as vulgar as it was, Shilian could only force himself to think in that direction. Just then, the sound of a girl screaming suddenly came from outside the temple. Help! Help! Shilian and Shonji both looked out of the window at the same time. Where Roya had formed the white circle, a man was trying to drag that bandaged boy out, while Xiaoying clung to the man's leg, not letting go. The man started yelling curses. It was Xiao Pengtou. Fuck off! You dumbass, what if you call that female ghost over? Xiao Ying shouted, "If she comes, she comes! You're scarier than any ghosts! I'd rather see a female ghost instead!" Turned out that Xiao Pengtou, who Shi Lian had knocked out with one whip of his silk band, had come too. When he saw the sluggishly fumbling brides all around, he at first jumped in surprise, but soon realized none of them could detect humans. He was exceedingly gutsy, hot-headed, and foolhardy, and he planned to drag the bandaged boy down the mountain to collect his bounty while no one else dared to move. He didn't care at all whether or not this boy was really the ghost groom. Everyone down the mountain said he was, so he was. Yet unexpectedly, Xiao Ying pounced over, screaming and shouting, alerting all the different brides in the surrounding area, including Shangji inside the temple of Mingguang. Shi Lian saw that it was him again and mentally grumbled that he should have whipped him harder earlier. Best if the man was whipped so hard he didn't wake for 3 days and 3 nights. He shouted, "Go back into the circle!" Xiao Pengtou saw that a stream of black mist had come lunging at him and hastily retreated. However, the bandaged boy was still in his grip and Xiao Ying was still clinging onto his legs, so in the end he was still too slow by a beat. Instantly, the black mist enveloped him, and he was then sucked back to Shangji's hand. He turned his head to look. Wasn't this disheveled, long-haired, haunting, chilling woman the beautiful corpse he had touched among all those brides lying on the ground earlier? It wasn't until that moment that he finally learned what fear meant. He shrieked at the top of his lungs while Shangji curled her 5 fingers, digging them deep into the back of his head. In an instant, his skull was pulled out through the heavy layer of flesh on his scalp. The skull was just pulled out, was still steaming hot, its mouth still wide open, and screaming, "Ah!" The people within the white circle also had their mouths open, wide and screaming, so terrified that their souls had left their bodies. Ah! Xiao Ying, who was also thoroughly terrified, pulled the bandaged boy into the circle as she screamed. Shangji reached her fingers out at them again, but Shi Lian dashed over and blocked her. "General, please refrain from committing further murderous sins." He called her general in hopes of reminding her that she was once a heroine who fought bravely on the front lines to protect her kingdom. Yet Shangji crushed the head that was screaming in terror in her grip. The gorgeous face was now 7 parts twisted. She sneered, "Is he too scared to see me?" Shi Lian couldn't think of any other way, so he wondered if he should pretend to be someone sent by General Pei to smooth things over first. But Shangji didn't need his response at all. She laughed heartily and whipped around, pointing at the divine statue. "I burned your temples and caused havoc in your land, just so you'd come take one look at me. I've waited for you for years." She stared at that martial god statue in a long trance, then suddenly leapt up, strangling its neck and shaking it like mad. "But you still won't come see me? Is it because you know you wronged me? Won't you look at my legs? Look at how I am now. This is all for you, for you. Is your heart made of iron?" As a bystander, Shi Lian didn't want to comment on who was right or wrong, but in his opinion, he really couldn't help but think, if you wanted to see him, could you not have used a saner method? In any case, if someone did all this because they wanted to see me, I would have 0 desire to show up. On the other end, Xiao Ying and that bandaged boy finally returned to the circle anew. Looking his way, she whispered in concern, "Young master?" Hearing her, Shi Lian gave her a smile, indicating that she needn't worry. Yet unexpectedly, the moment he smiled, Shangji's face instantly contorted and she lunged over from the divine statue. "Since you won't look at me and prefer to look at those girls who love smiling, I'll let you look to your heart's content." Although the one she was strangling was Shi Lian, her words were directed at General Pei. At first, Shi Lian had thought that Shangji's heart was full of jealousy for those happily smiling brides in their sedans, because she herself couldn't marry the one she loved. He had expected that it was because this General Pei liked girls. He hadn't expected that it was because this General Pei liked girls who smiled. So she, in her distorted mind, connected that to brides who were about to marry their lovers. No wonder she burned all the Mingguang temples around the mountain. Now that he thought about it, it was probably because she couldn't stand having to share this one divine statue with all those women who'd visit Mingguang temples day in and day out. The female ghost was indeed a wrath. Even with both legs broken, her movements were fast as a devil's, and even after being beaten by Roya, her strength was still formidable. Shi Lian couldn't keep going with her strangling him like this, but just as he was about to summon Roya, there was a loud cry. "Ah!" That girl Xiao Ying, saw that he couldn't hang on anymore, so she picked up a branch and came charging over. She was yelling as she charged, seeming to pump up courage for herself, but Shang-Chi didn't even need to lift a finger. She only gave a chilling look, and before Xiaoying had even gotten close, she was sent flying meters away and crashed heavily onto the ground headfirst. The bandaged boy croaked out aloud, "Ah!" as he ran over. Shi Lian was shocked too, but right as he sat up, he felt a chill on the back of his head. Shang-Chi's 5 fingers were already in place, like she was going to yank his skull from his skin just like earlier. In this dire situation, Shi Lian's right hand shot out and grabbed her wrist. He shouted, "Bind!" A sharp whoosh sound echoed through the air, and the white silk bandage heeded the command, circling and twisting about Shang-Chi, trussing her up. Shang-Chi's legs were broken, so she couldn't dodge in time. Thus, with a heavy thud, she fell to her knees and started rolling on the ground, trying to break free of the white silk band. Yet the more she struggled, the tighter the bindings became. The instant he was set free, Shi Lian didn't even take a moment to catch his breath before he immediately got to his feet and ran to where Xiaoying landed. Even with Roya having been recalled, most of the crowd still didn't dare to move rashly. But there was also a number of daring villagers who had gotten used to those fumbling brides and went circling. The bandaged boy was kneeling next to Xiaoying's sprawled form, not knowing what to do, so anxious he was like a small insect on the rim of a boiling pot. No one dared touch her, afraid that she had broken something critical, and that if she struggled, the injury would worsen. Shi Lian gave a quick once-over and knew that no matter how careful he was, it would be pointless. There was no way she'd survive after such a fall. While he hadn't interacted much with this girl, Xiaoying hadn't even spoken with her much. Shi Lian still knew she was a kind-hearted girl despite her ugly appearance. Such an ending for her truly made the heart heavy. At least Shang-Chi shouldn't be able to struggle free of Roya. Shi Lian thought, even if it's pointless, Xiaoying shouldn't be left in this position right before her death. And so he very carefully flipped her over. Xiaoying's face was covered in blood, and the crowd around clicked their tongues and sighed as they watched. However, she still had breath left, and she whispered, "Young master, have I made things worse?" Although she didn't make anything worse, she didn't actually help either. Shi Lian was already going to summon Roya at the time and didn't require anyone else's help. Besides, with that single branch of hers, even if she managed to hit Shang-Chi, it wouldn't have done anything. Never mind that she wouldn't have been able to get near the female ghost body in the first place. With all that, this could be said to be a completely meaningless death. Shi Lian answered, "No, you've been a great help. You see, the moment you came over, the female ghost's attention was diverted, which was how I had the chance to subdue her. Thank you so very much. But you can't do that again next time, all right? If you're going to help, you have to tell me first. Otherwise, if I don't pick up on it, things will go downhill fast." Xiaoying chuckled. "Young master, you don't need to comfort me anymore. I know that I wasn't any help, and that there won't be a next time." Her words were jumbled and unclear, and when she spat out a mouthful of blood, there was even a few broken front teeth mixed in. That bandaged boy was shaking with panic, woo-wooing, trying to speak. Xiaoying turned to him. "In the future, don't go down the mountain to steal food anymore. If you're discovered, you'll be beaten to death." "If he ever gets hungry, he can come to me," Shi Lian said. Xiaoying's eyes lit up hearing this. "Really? Then thanks so much." She smiled and smiled until suddenly 2 lines of tears streamed down from that pair of tiny eyes. She whispered, "I feel I haven't lived through many good days in all my life, here in this world." Shi Lian didn't know what to say, so he gently patted her hand. Xiaoying then sighed, "Never mind. Maybe I'm just born unlucky." Her jumbled words certainly did sound a little odd. With a bent nose and slanted eyes and an appearance so ugly it was silly, her bloodied, tear-streaked face was almost funny to behold. With tears still rolling down, she choked. "But even then, I still... Her breathing stopped, and she passed with those words. The bandaged boy saw that she had died and started to weep quietly while hugging her dead body. His face was buried in her belly like he had lost his only pillar of support, and he didn't dare to raise his head no matter what. As for Shi Lian, he reached out and helped close her eyes. He spoke to her mentally. "You're stronger than me." Right then, the sound of a bizarre bell tolled. Clang, 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 3 booming tolls, and all of a sudden Shi Lian felt his head go dizzy. He wondered out loud, "What's going on?" Then he looked all around. All the brides had collapsed to the ground, only their arms still up and reaching toward the sky. The crowd of villagers had also slumped, as if they were all knocked out by the sound of the deafening bells. Shi Lian himself felt his head become rather heavy, and though he forced himself to stand with his hand supporting his forehead, his legs went weak, and he fell with one knee to the ground. Fortunately, someone helped support him. When Shi Lian looked up, it was Nanfeng. Turned out, the moment those 7 brides entered the forest, they immediately spread out. Nanfeng had run almost all over the entirety of Mount Yujin before he managed to capture all of them, and had only just returned. Seeing him quite calm, Shi Lian immediately asked, "What's with that bell?" "Don't worry, it's reinforcements," Nanfeng replied. Shi Lian looked over. Following his gaze, only then did he notice that before the Temple of Mingguang, a row of soldiers had appeared, standing there since who knows when. These soldiers were outfitted in armor, emitting sharp and awe-inspiring auras, and their bodies were enveloped in a thin sheen of spiritual light. In front of the soldiers there stood a poised, elegant, and tall young military general, obviously not a mortal. That military general approached with his hands clasped behind his back and came before Shi Lian, bending slightly at the waist, giving a quick bow. "Your Highness." Shi Lian hadn't yet opened his mouth to make inquiries before Nanfeng whispered to him, "This is General Pei." Shi Lian instantly took a glance at Shangji, who was on the ground. "General Pei?" This General Pei didn't quite match what he had imagined, and was also grossly different from the divine statues. That divine statue's heroic form was vivacious, its eyes spirited and energetic, with a handsomeness that was aggressive and invasive. While this young military general was also handsome, his complexion was pale and his countenance was as calm as cool jade. There was no sense of a murderous aura, only an unrippled tranquility. He was a military general, but he could also be said to be a tactician. General Pei noticed Shangji on the ground and spoke. "The palace of Lingwen informed us that the incident at Mount Yujun might be related to our palace of Mingguang, and so this servant has come. I didn't expect that it really did have something to do with us. We have troubled your Highness." Shi Lian thanked Lingwen mentally. He wondered, how in the world was the palace of Lingwen inefficient? He replied, "General Pei is working hard too." Shangji, who was still vaguely struggling, heard the words General Pei and suddenly looked up. She demanded enthusiastically, Pei dear, is that you? Have you come? Have you finally come?" She was bound by Roye, and as overjoyed as she was, she could only rise to a kneel. Yet unexpectedly, her face immediately blanched the moment she saw that military general. "Who are you?" On his end, Shi Lian had already given Nanfeng a general account of what just happened, of just what the Ghostgrim affair was about. When he heard her, he wondered, "Isn't this General Pei? Could she have waited for so long that she doesn't recognize him anymore?" "This is General Pei," Nanfeng answered, "but it's not the one she's waiting for." Shi Lian was confused. "Are there 2 General Peis?" Yet Nanfeng replied, "That's correct. There are indeed 2 of them." Turned out, the General Pei this female ghost Shangji was waiting for was the main god of the Temple of Mingguang. The one before them now was the deputy god of the Palace of Mingguang, a descendant of the senior General Pei. In order to differentiate the 2, everyone addressed this one as General Pei Jr. In legitimate Mingguang temples, both must be worshipped, one facing the front and one facing the back. General Pei was the principal god of the main hall, so his divine statue faced the entrance of the temple hall, whereas General Pei Jr.'s divine statue was set up behind. While he was of a later generation than his ancestor, by looks they appeared no different than brothers. 2 ascendees from one household was certainly considered a beautiful tale. Shangji scanned the area and didn't see the one she wanted to see among the soldiers. She cried bitterly, "Where's Pei Ming? Why hasn't he come? Why won't he come see me?" General Pei Jr. inclined his head and replied, "General Pei has important business to tend to." Shangji muttered, "Important business?" Tears streamed beneath the long hair that draping over her face. "I've waited for him for hundreds of years. What important business could he have? Back then, in order to see me, he would cross half the border in one night. So what important business could he have now? So important that he can't even come down to spare me a glance. Is there something important? I don't think there is." "General Shangji, please be on your way," General Pei Jr. said. From the troop, 2 soldiers of the Palace of Mingguang approached and pulled Roye from Shangji's person. After it affectionately wrapped itself back around Shi Lian's wrist, he gently patted it twice to comfort it. Shangji allowed herself to be grabbed by those 2 soldiers briefly dazed before she suddenly started struggling with force, cursing while she pointed at the heavens. Pei Ming, I curse you! The screech was sharp, and Shi Lian was taken aback, thinking to himself, isn't this cursing the ancestor in front of his descendant? General Pei Jr., however, didn't react at all. He said impassively, please excuse us. Shangji screamed until she went hoarse. I curse you! You'd best never fall in love with anyone. Otherwise, if the day should come, I'll curse you to be just like me, to burn with the fire of love unceasingly, forever and ever. The fire of love will burn your body, scorch your heart and your insides. Right then, General Pei Jr. greeted Shi Lian and the others. Excuse us, please wait a moment. Then he raised his middle and index finger and lightly pressed them against his temple. This was a spell to activate the spiritual communication array, so he had to be communicating with someone. A moment later, he ended and dropped his hand, clasping it behind him again, then turned to Shangji. General Pei wants me to tell you, that's impossible. Shangji screeched, I curse you! General Pei Jr. waved his hand slightly and ordered, take her away. The two soldiers carried Shangji, who was still struggling like crazy, and dragged her off. Shi Lian spoke up. General Pei Jr., might I ask, how will Shangji be handled? Sealed under a mountain, General Pei Jr. replied. To use a mountain as a seal was certainly the usual way the heavenly realm dealt with monsters and ghosts. After a brief moment of hesitation, Shi Lian continued. General Shangji's resentment is quite strong. She couldn't let go of the hatred that stemmed from betraying her kingdom for General Pei. Perhaps sealing isn't the right long-term solution. General Pei Jr., however, only inclined his head. She said she betrayed her kingdom because of General Pei? She certainly did say so, Shi Lian said, and that it was because of General Pei that she became like this. Whether that's the truth, though, I don't know. If it must be said that way, it's not altogether wrong, General Pei Jr. said. She did betray her kingdom for General Pei. However, the details might be different from what bystanders might imagine. After she and General Pei separated, in order to keep him, General Shangji offered up military intelligence of her own volition. General Pei was unwilling to win unfairly, so he didn't take the offer. Well now, who would ever have expected that the whole I betrayed my kingdom for you thing was actually something like that? Shi Lian replied. Then when she said both legs being broken was also because of General Pei, it was... She broke those legs herself, General Pei Jr. answered. Broke them herself? General Pei Jr. replied emotionlessly. General Pei doesn't like forceful women, but General Shangji has a strong character, which was why they couldn't be together for long. General Shangji couldn't accept it and told General Pei that she was willing to sacrifice for him and change herself. Thus, she ruined her own martial skills and broke her own legs. With that, she basically destroyed her own wings to tie herself to General Pei's side. General Pei didn't abandon her to her own devices and kept her around to take care of her, but he never intended to marry her. General Shangji's wish was never fulfilled, and so she killed herself out of resentment. Not for anything else, but just so General Pei would be sad. However, pardon my bluntness, the way he spoke had always been polite and overly calm. That would never happen. Shi Lian rubbed his forehead and didn't speak, thinking to himself, who the heck are these people? General Pei Jr. continued, I don't know the right and wrong of all this either. I only know that if General Shangji was willing to let go, things wouldn't have to be this way. Your Highness, I will take my leave now. Shi Lian also cupped his hands and sent them off. Nenfeng commented, weirdos. Shi Lian thought he himself was the laughingstock of the three realms, an infamous weirdo, so he'd best not comment on anyone else. This was something between General Pei and Shangji, so for bystanders, there was no point in discussing who was right or wrong. Their sympathies only went out to all 17 for those innocent brides and the military officials and sedan drivers who escorted them, but suffered a terrible fate for no reason. Having brought up the subject of brides, Shi Lian instantly turned his gaze to look and saw that the 17 corpses of the brides had started to show various stages of deterioration. Some had already dissolved into white bones, while some were starting to rot, emitting waves of foul odor. The stench roused the people lying on the ground, and they had gradually came to, but when they saw the scene they jumped in shock and terror once more. Shilian used this opportunity to nag at them and spread the philosophy of good and bad karma, advising them to pray a lot for each of the brides once they went back down the mountain, and to think of a way to contact the families of those brides to come and collect their corpses. He also cautioned that they must never commit the same deeds as those corpse sellers, and they shouldn't commit any wrongdoings either. After such a thrilling night, and with the lead instigator gone, no one else dared to speak against Shilian. They each acknowledged him apprehensively, all of them feeling like they just had a nightmare. Only then did they realize that they had acted as if possessed. Why were their minds filled only with money when there were so many dead people around? Thinking back, they all found it horrifying. The night before, everyone was doing the same thing, relying on the fact that their numbers were great and they had a leader, and they all rushed in without thinking. Now that they harbored fear in their minds, they very earnestly repented and prayed for blessings. The day hadn't yet broken. Fearing that there might be wolves and others stirring up trouble, even though Nanfeng had just run a huge circle around the whole mountain, he now had to lead this large group of people back down. He didn't complain, however, and arranged with Shilian to discuss afterwards what to be done with the forest of upside-down corpses. When the bandaged boy woke up, he sat next to Xiao Ying's corpse once more, hugging her, not saying a word, and so Shilian also sat down next to him. He spent a while coming up with a script, but just as he was about to speak to comfort him, Shilian suddenly noticed that the boy's head was bleeding. If it was from the corpse forest, then it would have dried, but this blood was still dripping, so it could only be from an injury. Right then, Shilian told him, "Your head is wounded. Take off your bandages and let me have a look." The boy slowly looked up. Those bloodshot eyes glanced at him like he was scared and hesitant. Shilian smiled gently. "Don't be afraid. If there's a wound, then it must be dressed. I promise I won't be scared off by you." The boy hesitated for a moment, then turned around, and circle by circle he slowly unwrapped the bandages. His movements were very slow, but Shilian waited for him patiently and was already pondering the issues that would come after. This boy for sure can't stay on Mount Yushin anymore. But where can he go? He can't come back to the heavens with me, and I don't even know where my next meal is coming from. I'll have to think of a reliable way to settle him. And the green ghost Qirong. Just then the boy finished removing the bandages and turned around. And just as Shilian saw that face in its entirety, he felt like all of the blood in his veins had drained completely. And that's chapter 4.